Thank you, everybody. Nice to see you all in this lovely sunny place. So I worked with OMERACT and also Impact, looking at various patient-reported outcome measures. And through the discussions, it became apparent that if we saw chronic pain as a symptom, then it was simple. We just used a visual analog score or a numerical rating score. And we had lots of conversations on this pre-workshop about what is it that pain actually was, and I presented this a presentation. And this work has subsequently been published in the Journal of Rheumatology. So we had a little straw poll. It wasn't very scientific, just to get an idea of what the people within the workshop actually felt chronic pain was. And as you can see, a large amount of them didn't know what it was, which was not particularly a helpful starting point, but it gave for a whole day of discussions anyway. So we had to define what we meant by a symptom, a disease, a collection of disease, a syndrome. So again, this is in the paper, and this was circulated for after the poll to actually work out what it is we were talking about. So the challenge then was to discuss what chronic pain actually was. What do we mean by chronic pain? And actually look at the discussions were very complex and very nuanced, because we know that chronic pain is not just a simple process where pain, nociception, is being processed in the brain. It's also being processed in the brain along with lots of other information, depending on who you are and how you feel. So it can involve the common, which is not really accepted now, pain centres, but also it can equally involve visual centres, centres that process fear, centres that process depression, etc. So there's lots of conversations around that. We didn't talk about neuropathic pain because possibly maybe neuropathic pain is the disease of central nervous system, and we didn't deal with cancer pain. We considered various complexities around the pathophysiological mechanisms and structural changes as a result of pain. We had varying degrees of terminologies that are around pain, and we also looked at some people who live with pain have very complex changes associated with those pains, and other people don't. So there's a huge variety of how people respond to pain. And we also looked at issues of grouping all pain conditions in a disease model. Should we actually do that? Because there's lots of different types of pain out there. So the literature, we did a review of the literature it's stood, and these are some of the key components that came out of the literature review. So Cousins and Siddall and Cousins suggested that because pain had signs and symptoms and its own specific cause, it should be classified as a disease. And I'm sure you'd argue, as I did, that in fact pain doesn't have necessarily a cause. There might not be a reason why people, for instance, develop fibromyalgia. And also that they're not specific signs and symptoms. There's different signs and symptoms depending on what type of chronic pain that you have. And that the psychological sequelae are unique to chronic pain. Again, I challenge you to say that they're not. If you've got chronic obstructive airways disease, if you've got heart disease, you will possibly be depressed, you will feel socially isolated, you will catastrophize. So they're not maybe pertinent to chronic pain as a disease in its own right. There's also evidence from Tracy and Bushnell that those living with chronic pain have altered brains compared with healthy controls. And there's all the issues around fMRI with that publication of the dead salmon having brain impact, function. And so there is a lot of things you can misread. But certainly we know that structural changes occur as a result of having chronic pain. You're more likely to lose cortex around your thalamic area and your dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Key areas that are involved in descending pain inhibition and placebo. We know that people with chronic pain have problems with the default mode network, which is your kind of housekeeping function, which in you and I without pain switched off when we do a task, but in somebody with chronic pain, it's still going, and it's like having your clutch and your foot on your clutch and your accelerator at the same time, so it's revving your brain constantly. And the researchers have suggested that it's not a brain that's processing painful information, but a brain that's largely changed because of this pain information. And then other people have argued that it's not a disease because it's possibly just changes in the brain because it's being bombarded with nociceptive input constantly. So the challenge then was disagreement about what chronic pain actually is, and untangling what it is, as I said, was complex and nuanced. Sorry, I'm going backwards. I thought I'd read that already. So chronic pain is a disease. So what qualifies chronic pain as a disease? Is its underlying mechanisms or the types of pain? So we had conversations around a disease of central sensitization, the fact that there are changes to the brain. The brain is the organ and the disease is the central sensitization changes. We also had conversations about, well, is it the type of pain you have? Because there's now some thought around things like fibromyalgia, irritable bowel, interstitial cystitis, temporomandibular joint disorder, all being part and parcel of a functional syndrome. They're all the different manifestations of the same condition in the brain. It possibly may be a disease of peripheral sensitization, but that's another paper. So in the paper that we published, there's a synopsis of the debate, some of which I've pulled out today. And Ernest Choi, who worked on this group, who's a rheumatology professor in the UK, came out with this figure to suggest it's very hard to kind of cram chronic pain into a model such as this, because there's all these other factors that are involved in the chronic pain process. And so if you say that the pain, if you say that rheumatoid arthritis is the pathology, you have signs and symptoms. If you treat all those signs and symptoms, rheumatoid arthritis is going to get better and the pain will disappear. And we know that that's not necessarily the case, because all these other factors that actually support pain as an experience in these patients. So the kind of and so what type things that came out of this. So there was uncertainty about whether it was a disease. We agreed that it was certainly a long-term condition that was unlikely to be cured. We thought that acute pain was a symptom, but whatever it is, it should no longer be managed with a biomedical model. It should be managed with a biopsychosocial model. Focused research activity around biomarkers and robust diagnostic criteria needed. And the impact on mood, function and social ability needs to be part of the outcomes that we're measuring across the whole range of those living with chronic pain. We need holistic assessment and management. And again, there's lots of impacts about when you're doing research on chronic pain, because if you're going to assess all these multiple variables in patients, one, if you accept a p-value of 0.05, 1 in 25 of your findings are going to be positive by chance. So you need to look at what you're doing and what you're managing. And there's also the response burden of subjecting those living with chronic pain to all this barrage of tests. So we had a lot of those discussions. And there's some papers that were also in the Journal of Rheumatology around harmonising outcome measures that I would recommend to you. So if chronic pain is a symptom, we can measure it with a visual analogue score. If it's not, if it's a disease, we really need to think how we're assessing pain and what we're researching from a pain perspective. Oops. So we came up with a number of actions as well, looking to increase research, to look at harmonising the outcomes that we're using to do research in people living with chronic pain. And that's it. I think that's my 15 minutes. Thank you for listening.